When I was invited to give the Botstiber lecture, I felt honored. So many distinguished voices have stood here talking to the audience, to an audience here in Washington, D.C. But then I thought, well, what do I talk about? There's so many aspects. There's so much to say about America and Austria, things that connect, things that divide, maybe. I've studied in this country, I worked here, I built friendships here. America has become a second home to me. And then I chose to speak about the media, my professional home, for over 30 years by now. I've worked on both sides of the Atlantic. I began as a young journalist, working for the Voice of America as a radio reporter at its East Europe bureau in Vienna. I later spent, as my speakers before have said, I spent 3 decades working for Austria's public broadcaster ORF. I began as Far East correspondent in Tokyo, then for almost 20 years as an anchor, and finally here in Washington, D.C. as correspondent and bureau chief. And here is why media matter. They shape how we see the world, how we see each other. They frame our perception, they frame the perception of foreign countries, and define the boundaries of our understanding, if you want to put it that way. Let me start with a personal note. I'm Austrian by birth, but America is the country that opened up the world to me. I came here as a Fulbright student when I was 21 years old to study, as you said, at the University of Notre Dame. For those of you who know it, yes, South Bend, Indiana, the Golden Dome, legendary football weekends, and miles of cornfields. I would have preferred to go to California, but my friends at the time assured me this is real America. They were right. Years later, I returned to Washington, D.C., this time as ORF's bureau chief, covering Obama's second term here, and 4 years, the first term, the chaos, the rather chaotic term of Trump's first presidency. My job was to explain America to Austrians. Not an easy job to interpret a complex, fascinating, and sometimes really baffling country. But that brings me to the core of my talk today. How do media influence our perceptions, and more importantly, what do we fail to understand because of how the media work? Lost in translation, I think, is what Reinhard called it, and there's a lot lost in translation. The survey I found fascinating. It revealed, as we have heard, that Austrians have increasingly skeptical and often negative views of Austria. Several reasons Reinhard identified: ideology, political leanings, yes, the Trump factor, but what really stands out in that survey is one sentence, which I quote: "Certain contradictions in Austrian views of the US suggest a lack of understanding of American society and politics." That is powerful, and it raises the big question for me: what role do the media play in that misunderstanding? Do we give our viewers, our listeners, enough guidance, enough explanation to help them understand? Who do we listen to? Who do we report about? The one who shouts loudest? The one who makes the most outrageous claims? Who do we hear in that noise that's out there? Do we explain the difference between news and fake news, between hard facts and lies? And let's be honest, for most Austrians, America is a media construct. Few have been here. It's really a minority who have traveled to the United States and know the country. Most form opinions through headlines, through images, through sound bites, and the media, I would argue, are both mirrors and lenses. Mirrors, they reflect events, but they are also lenses. They distort, they frame, they color, and they filter. And the filters are strong. Let me quote Frank Sesno. He is a former CNN Washington bureau chief, a former colleague of mine. He's now professor of media and public affairs here at George W. at George Washington University. He's a very respected media scholar. I interviewed him several times when I was a correspondent here, and he told me once, quote, "We in the media go where the drama is. That's where the ratings are, that's where the clicks are, but not where deeper understanding and context are," end quote. And that's so true. I think that is part of our problem, that is definitely the problem, especially when it comes to understanding America, a nation that thrives on contradictions. I agree with him when Frank says, no, when he says it's absolutely necessary to confront and push and question those in power. That's our role as media. The media should do that, the media must do that. But they should also and must also make time to ask the why question, the how does it work question, the what's the problem here question, end quote. I moved back to Austria in 2021, early 2021, and I've lost count of how many times Austrians have asked me, how is it possible that Donald Trump is back? How could Americans elect him again? Are all Americans crazy? It's a question I really get that every few weeks somehow somebody asks me that question. I would argue, no. Half of the country is not crazy. Many intelligent, educated, successful people voted for Donald Trump, some reluctantly, and I always think of a friend of mine out in California who said, I had to hold my nose and put my cross, but I voted for him. Ignoring Trump voters won't help us understand the United States. Listening to them might help us understand. But the catch is the media are lopsided. We get Donald Trump, we in Austria, we get Donald Trump in sound bites. When he is at his most outrageous, when he once again insults somebody, when he insults Europe, calls the European Union horrible, pathetic, formed to screw the United States, when he calls Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator and a week later claims he doesn't remember doing that. We do not see him as his supporters see him. I have often heard from them, don't take him so literally. Everywhere I have heard that, even Trump supporters back in Austria, we the press, enthusiastically report another executive order that he has signed, but we are less enthusiastic about reporting the courts reversing that order. It's part of what I like to call the Aufregungskultur that we live in, this permanent state of excitement that we in the news live in. And also there's another factor. We in Austria, I'm a little confused with my we's here, because I feel a little bit American, a little bit part of the media, and a little bit Austrian. But we in Austria, we rely heavily on liberal US outlets like the New York Times. A really, really great paper, but one with a very specific worldview. Its readership is about 10 million in a country of 350 million. We quote the New York Times all the time, but we rarely hear from the other side. We watch CNN, it has a primetime audience of 700,000. Fox News has almost 2.5 million viewers. How many Austrians watch Fox News? I'm not suggesting that you should, but if we want to understand America, we need to understand its divisions, and US media reflect those divisions. With Donald Trump's arrival on the political scene, I remember clearly, the press became pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I'm sure you have noticed that too. I watched it firsthand as a correspondent. There's very little middle ground left, and that polarization is corroding trust. We see it in the statistics. The Pew Research Center, a very respected nonpartisan research center, says only 32% of Americans trust national news organizations, and that's really down sharply from previous decades. Americans, it's a quote now, Americans' trust in the media to tell them the truth has declined sharply. Austria fares better, a little better. About 41% express trust in the news, most of the time, according to the Reuters Institute. But Also in Austria, skepticism is rising, especially among younger digital native audiences. And then there's the explosion of social media. Everyone who has a microphone, everyone who has a camera is a journalist now, or at least they think they are. Truth, sourcing, verification, optional. Content is driven by clicks, not credibility. Users live in echo chambers. They see what they want to see, they hear what they want to hear, they read what they want to read. They just want to reinforce their own world view in these echo chambers. It's so much easier. You don't have to talk to others, you don't have to confront others or maybe listen to another argument. But I find that very dangerous, not just for journalism, but for democracy. And you may have seen that a few days ago. The 2025 Democracy Perception Index was published. According to the survey, global perceptions of the United States are worse than those of China. In other words, China is more popular than the US in the world these days. Among European countries, Austrians are some of the most critical according to this index. That's alarming. The perception is the US no longer stands for democracy. That's really a tragedy because media have the power to challenge that narrative. Too often we don't do it. Too often we fail. We report the outrage, we miss the nuance. We go for tweets, we don't quote the context. Not always, but very often we don't do that. I would like to mention one example. A case that shook the journalistic world. James Bennett, a respected American journalist who now works for The Economist, which by the way I think does great journalism. Bennett was the editorial page editor of the New York Times until 2020. If you remember 2020, it was that crazy year, the year of the pandemic, the year of the murder of John Floyd, of protests, of unrest, of riots even. The New York Times published, and he as the top editorial editor of the New York Times, published several pieces on supporting protests, supporting defunding the police, whatever was in the news then. But he also published a piece by Senator Tom Cotton calling for federal troops to quell riots. Bennett was fired, he lost his job. He later wrote a scathing critique entitled When the New York Times Lost Its Way. He criticized the Times for having lost its original goal of unbiased reporting. He says the Times has become increasingly intolerant of conservative viewpoints and prioritizes ideological conformity over journalistic pluralism. He wrote, and I quote, "The Times has become the publication through which America's progressive elite talks to itself about an America that doesn't really exist." You may disagree, and let me repeat at this point, I do think the New York Times is a great newspaper. But his point that ideological conformity is overtaking journalistic pluralism is worth hearing. At least let's talk about it and let's listen. It's true for both sides. It's not just that the conservative side isn't heard or the other side isn't heard. It's just that people don't talk and don't want to get into arguments and don't want to listen to arguments. That's the better way of putting it. It's supported by a statistic. Again, pure Americans' trust in the news media to tell them the truth has declined sharply. And that brings me back to Austria. We quote liberal US media. We do not always point out that only part of the American public gets their information from the New York Times, the Washington Post, from CNN, that the other half sees things differently. We, speaking of Austrian media, don't have enough foreign correspondents, not enough boots on the ground, if you want to call it that way, not enough people living in a country and reporting from a country from the US. Most Austrian media outlets rely on news agencies. They maybe send correspondents just for events, but they don't have people who live here. It's just not the same as lived and observed experience. So my appeal is, as someone who has worked both in Vienna and in Washington, Journalists should do their job, let them do their jobs, let them go out, dig deep, tell the full story, not just the trending story, give them airtime for quiet stories, not just the sensational ones. It might change the picture a little. I would like to give you an example. It was in 2017, I did a story about, you remember, first Trump years, I did a story about the middle-class family of Trump supporters in Fargo, North Dakota. I mean, yes, I wanted to go to Fargo, I wanted to see it. Anybody who has seen the film of the Coen Brothers probably wants to go and see Fargo, so I did too, and I was so happy my producer found a family in Fargo. I wanted to show that it's not only the loud, brash Trump fans that you meet at rallies who support Donald Trump, but also normal families. Several times my story, which I did for the evening news program, got kicked out, got postponed, was rescheduled, not because it was a bad story, I was rather proud of that story, but because it was a quiet story and not a noisy one. It wasn't sexy enough, like Donald Trump releasing yet another outrageous tweet, or these days something on Truth Social. Those are the sexy stories. The quiet ones, the ones about people whose view you don't necessarily share, need airtime too. My Fargo piece, it did eventually. And maybe, I hope so, it helped correct the picture just a little. I wrote a book last year about Trump voters, not about Donald Trump, about Trump voters. We, the publisher and me in that order, finally arrived at the title, Who is Afraid of Donald Trump? Today I would call it, Who is Not Afraid of Donald Trump? Because that's how it works, sees it. I did not write it because I agree so much with Trump voters, but because I think their voices are not heard enough. America is not only the East Coast bubble, it's not only Washington, it's not only the California bubble, there's also the population in the rural Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota, the folks in the South, the farmers in Iowa. In the past month, I have talked a lot to audiences in Austria, in small towns in Austria, out in the provinces, presenting my books, talking to them about America, and they were really surprised when you tell them stories about America, when you talk about the ways people live here, and that they don't always see everything the same way we Austrians see it, or we Europeans see it, because they are socialized differently, because they live in a different environment. When I tell them, that 46% of women voted for Donald Trump, they are totally surprised, because the idea that Donald Trump and women, that doesn't go together, it's deeply rooted in their thinking. Also, they are very surprised when I tell them that minorities, the number of people voting for, number of minority members voting for Donald Trump has been increasing steadily ever since he entered the political scene. Honestly, several of them, quite a few of them told me afterwards, it's really interesting if you talk to us about that, because I just didn't know that. What's missing in what we get in the news is very often different sides of the same story. Okay, I'd be leaving out a crucial part of the picture if I didn't address Donald Trump's renewed assault on the news media, because that is really troubling. Let me give you an example. I think I mentioned at the beginning that I started my career at Voice of America, a federally funded news outlet committed to independent journalism. Under Donald Trump, VOA was abruptly shut down last March on flimsy grounds. Journalists, friends, and clients were locked out of their offices, told not to return. The message was clear. Independence is conditional, and it hasn't stopped there. Major outlets like the Associated Press have been banned from the presidential press pool. For those of you who are not in the news business, who are unfamiliar with the news, the AP, the Associated Press, is a highly respected news agency with its own highly respected, again, code of journalistic conduct. The pool, the press pool, is a group of journalists on a rotation basis, a small group who cover the president at the Oval Office or on Air Force One. The White House is where the president is. And they report back to the rest of us and give us the color to the stories they are doing to the stories we then report it's really simple things to report back. Sometimes like POTUS were wearing a red tie today, or wheels up at Andrews Air Force Base at 4 p.m., something like that. Why was the AP, the Associated Press, banned? Because it continued to refer to the Gulf of Mexico instead of using Trump's term, the Gulf of America. Let me again quote Frank Sesno, the media scholar. What is essentially happening here, he says, is the Trump administration is saying, if you do a story we don't like, we'll push you out of the press room, out of your traditional space. It's disturbing, yes. We in the press have got used to being called out by the president during his rallies. I've been there on the press riser in the back usually, and he always refers to you, the dishonest press, there in the back, the lying media, unfailingly his probes, loud booing by his supporters. You get used to that after a while. Another example, which I think is significant, what's happening in the White House press room, it's a game changer. The Trump administration has opened the doors to influencers, TikTokers, podcasters, YouTubers, whatnot. There's absolutely nothing wrong with admitting representatives of new media, but some of them are people with huge followings, but little or no journalistic training. And guess what? Many of the questions that are asked there are anything but tough softball questions. Why? Because these influencers are often handpicked for being friendly with the administration. It's shaking up the media landscape. It's about controlling the narrative and turning the press room into a PR stage. It's deeply worrying for anyone who believes that the free press is a pillar of democracy. But, very important, let's not lose perspective. This is still a country with constitutional protections. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. This is not Russia. Journalists here still fight back, courts still push back. And honestly, I'm shocked when I'm in Austria, and sometimes I get a question like, do you really consider the United States a democracy? It shocks me deeply, but on the other hand, this kind of pressure that's being put on the press, on the media right now, it erodes public trust, it intimidates reporters, it weakens democracy, and that should concern all of us. I realize I've said much about how American media shape the US, the other way around, how Austrian media shape the view of the US. I should also say a little about how American media shape the US view of Austria. And because I'm here and I see part of this exhibition that if you go back to Vienna, you should absolutely see it, Controlled Freedom, it reminded me so much of why America was always such a fascinating country for me. This is the time right after the war when America reintroduced or introduced democracy to Austria, and America did just about everything right at the time. They helped newspapers, they helped found newspapers like the Salzburger Nachrichten, the Oberösterreichischen Nachrichten. The Americans knew what they were doing, and they really did it all right. But I was talking about American media shaping the US view of Austria. I also worked for American media based in Austria during the wartime years. I was working for the Voice of America at that time. That, honestly, that was a little strange for an Austrian doing these stories. My boss, an American, he was basically interested in the Warsaw Pact, and he quietly passed all the one-time stories to me. It was really weird. Austria, which is usually an afterthought in the media, was front-page news all the time. I tried to do what journalists are supposed to do, report the facts, stay objective, provide context. It wasn't always easy at the time. This wasn't just a personal scandal. For American media, it was a symbolic test, a test of whether Austria would finally confront its Nazi past or continue to cling to the myth of being Hitler's first victim. You may remember the Reagan administration officially banned Weit. I have trouble pronouncing that name. I never know which language I should go with. They banned him from entering the United States, and the American press treated the affair as a moral and political scandal of global importance. Their coverage did not just inform, it shaped international opinion. It forced, in Austria, it forced a national reckoning. It revealed what had been hidden. It showed the world the power of journalism, not just to report history, but to influence it. Also, I remember one detail vividly. Voice of America had strict editorial rules. It didn't always have a good reputation in Europe, but the rules were really, really strict. Every radio report I filed on Waldheim had to end with a sentence like, Mr. Waldheim denies the charges. State what the other side says, what the other side thinks. That kind of fairness I haven't always seen at every outlet I have worked for. Fast forward to today, and the US coverage of Austria is once again selective. It's not very often in the news. When it makes the headlines, it's often about immigration policy, it's about far-right politics. When we talk about maybe if it could be in the government or not, it's about some new power struggle, or maybe the occasional burst of sound of music nostalgia. Yes, it still happens. The older generation still remembers the sound of music. Also, I should add, digital platforms have opened space for more nuanced stories. Independent journalists and niche media, niche outlets now highlight Austria's innovation in urban design, in sustainability, in education, but these stories often only reach a very specialized audiences. They are not mainstream stories. Mainstream US media still operate on a simple rule, like Austrian mainstream media also, unfortunately, most of the time, conflict and nostalgia sells in the case of the US. As another media scholar, James Hamilton put it, market incentives and editorial priorities still favor stories of drama, division, or sentiment. Emotional than reason. That's the challenge. The full picture of Austria or any country really rarely fits into a headline. It requires curiosity, it requires depth and context. In other words, it requires real journalism. So, to summarize, media can build bridges, but only if we report across divides, not from within them. Have more face-to-face conversations with people we agree with, we disagree with. Have the courage to hear their point of view if we disagree with them. Let's restore trust, let's restore balance, let's listen, not just to what we want to hear, but what we need to understand. Thank you. And